On October 21, 1978, a young pilot calmly radioed air traffic control to report something flying beside him. Minutes later, his final words were, "It is hovering, and it's not an aircraft." He was never seen again. That night, Frederick Valentich, a 20-year-old pilot, was flying alone over the Bass Strait in Australia, under nearly perfect conditions. The weather was clear, visibility was excellent, and nothing about the flight suggested danger. Frederick had rented a Cessna 182 for what was meant to be a routine journey to King Island, a trip he had planned and prepared for carefully. At 7:06 p.m., Frederick made contact with Melbourne Flight Service and spoke with air traffic controller Steve Roby. At first, the conversation was ordinary and professional, exactly what would be expected during a routine flight. Then Frederick asked an unusual question. He wanted to know if there was any known air traffic flying below 5,000 feet in his area. After checking the radar, the controller replied that there was no known traffic nearby. Frederick paused, then calmly insisted that something was there. He explained that a large object was flying close to his plane, and that it did not resemble any aircraft he recognized. He reported seeing 4 bright green lights attached to the object, and estimated that it had passed him at an extremely high speed, far beyond what any conventional aircraft could reach. As the transmission continued, Frederick's voice began to change. He explained that the object was no longer simply passing by, but was now orbiting his plane, circling him deliberately, as if it were aware of his presence. The controller repeatedly asked Frederick to identify the aircraft, hoping it might be a military jet or another civilian plane. Frederick struggled to describe what he was seeing. He said the object appeared metallic and shiny, with a solid structure that reflected light. His voice trembled slightly as he explained that it did not behave like anything he had ever encountered before. Then, suddenly, he reported that the object had disappeared completely. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that whatever Frederick had seen was gone. Seconds later, Frederick reported that it had returned, but this time it was not beside him. It was above him. At 7:12 p.m., Frederick informed the controller that his engine was running rough and that it sounded like it was coughing. He said the object was now hovering directly over his aircraft, remaining stationary while his own plane began to malfunction. His breathing became heavier, and the tension in his voice was unmistakable. Moments later, Frederick transmitted his final words, stating clearly that the object hovering above him was not an aircraft. Immediately after that transmission, the radio signal changed. For the next 17 seconds, air traffic control heard a strange metallic noise coming through the radio, described later as scraping or grinding, as if metal were dragging against metal. There was no sound of an explosion, no indication of impact, and no evidence of a crash. Then the signal went silent. Frederick Valentich never responded again. Search and rescue operations began almost immediately. Aircraft and ships were sent to scour the Bass Strait, focusing on the area where Frederick had last been heard. The search continued for days, but investigators found no wreckage, no oil slick, and no trace of the plane or its pilot. It was as if both had vanished completely. What made the case even more unsettling was that later that same night, multiple witnesses on the ground reported seeing strange green lights moving erratically in the sky over the same region. Some described the lights as hovering, while others claimed they moved at incredible speeds before disappearing. Officially, the disappearance of Frederick Valentich remains unresolved. Authorities suggested that he may have become disoriented and crashed into the sea, possibly as a result of spatial confusion or stress. However, the complete absence of physical evidence left many unconvinced by this explanation. Frederick's father believed until his death that his son was still alive somewhere, convinced that the events of that night could not be explained by a simple aviation accident. Over the years, the case has become one of the most famous and debated aviation mysteries in history. More than 4 decades later, the question remains unanswered. Was Frederick Valentich the victim of a tragic and misunderstood accident, or did he encounter something unknown that night over the Bass Strait? Whatever was hovering above his plane was never identified, and Frederick Valentich was never found. If stories like this make you question how much of our world remains unexplained, consider subscribing to the Short Chapter, where we explore true mysteries that refuse to disappear.